through as many people as possible. There she is. All right, so hi everyone, welcome to our critique session number 2 with the Midwest Newsroom. Today, I think this is our second one, so after the first one, we know how this will run. I'll discuss a few of the ground rules, and then we'll just get started. The goal of these sessions are to give and receive constructive feedback. We want to point out the successful things in stories and talk about some of the challenges that each of the reporters faced from the reporter's perspective and how we might be able to address those struggles and apply the solutions to future stories. We don't want to be overly negative, of course, but we want to be helpful. So it's a safe place to discuss your thoughts on the story and how you might improve it. We're going to try to get through 4 stories today. We'll see how well that works, but we'll all listen to the story initially, and then Michael Leland, the news director at Iowa Public Radio, my co-host is here, and myself will give our thoughts. We've already listened to the stories and put together some of our notes on what we think about the piece. The reporters have all submitted a question or two of a focus of kind of what specific feedback that they're looking for, or any issues in the story that they want some help on. So I will make sure that I mention that after we come out of the story. We'll also have some time to talk with the reporter, and then also open it up to the entire group so we can help each other out, because the whole point of this is also that every editor kind of handles the story a little bit differently, so there's no correct way to do this, but there are strong ways that I think we can collectively agree on how to improve our stories. Any questions before we get going? Okay, I am going to pull up our first story, and that is from St. Louis Public Radio's Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt, thanks for submitting the story. While I change my audio, Eric, do you want to introduce the piece at all?
Sure. This was a unexpected piece, you could say. Early in March, I did a quick GA story about local efforts to help Ukrainians, and given the Russian invasion. And a source who I had reached out to for that story contacted me and said, hey, my parents, I sorry I didn't respond. I was helping get my parents out of Ukraine. Do you want to hear their story? And I ended up going over to their house, had a interview with them, interview with the son, and then turned a story about what they went through and how it came, how they were able to come to the United States. I think the major challenges in this were that both of the person's parents, they don't speak English, so it's having to deal with how you do translation tracks, and having different voices, having people voice underneath a interview track in English, and how to direct that, and just kind of pulling this together. I've never done a piece where the only experience I had was a couple bites in a previous piece that were in Spanish, and I think that's a little bit easier to handle than a mix of Ukrainian and Russian. So that was kind of like the challenges.
Yeah, awesome. All right, I'm going to go ahead and play it, and then let's listen, and then we'll talk about it.
This is St. Louis
Can
Public
everyone hear
Radio.
that?
More than 4.6 million Ukrainians have left their homes since the Russian military invaded almost 2 months ago. Many are in refugee camps or other living arrangements in Western European countries, but some have made it to the United States and St. Louis. St. Louis Public Radio's Eric Schmidt has the story of a couple who fled Ukraine to reunite with their son in St. Charles.
On a quiet cul-de-sac tucked behind the St. Charles Convention Center, a Ukrainian flag flutters outside.
If you're in a small school,
blue and yellow hues help the home stand out from its neighbors. Inside, we meet Volodymyr Zarybniak and his family.
Please come in. This is my parents.
my name is Victor.
Volodymyr and his wife have lived in the area since 2011, but his parents, Viktor and Svetlana, have only been there about a month. They never expected they would need to leave Kharkiv, Ukraine, their home of 40 years. Viktor and Svetlana were like many Ukrainians and didn't think Russia would actually invade.
Deep in my heart, I did not want to believe that Russia would attack, because Russia had given assurances of fraternal help, but it all turned out to be a hoax.
He says they did prepare, stocking extra food and medicine, but hoped the war wouldn't affect them. Then shelling started to hit Kharkiv, which is less than an hour from the Russian border. Viktor says he and his wife were unable to leave their home on the 7th floor because the elevators in their building were disabled.
We were terrified of each attack, realizing that the next shelling could hit our house. There were several houses nearby that had already been destroyed.
In the early days of the invasion, Viktor and Svetlana stayed in close contact with their son Volodymyr, who worked with his sister to find any way to help their parents escape.
I never experienced such situations before when I was calling and contacting just random people and trying to arrange their evacuation.
A way out of the country eventually materialized in early March. Volodymyr says he called his parents with the news and told them they had an hour to pack. They grabbed essentials like documents and medicine and left mostly everything else behind.
It was very difficult for us to decide to escape from here because everything is there. Our life we lived, everything there, we left as it is.
On their way out of Kharkiv, Viktor says they saw the aftermath from Russia's attack, burned out cars and destroyed homes. But he says the most difficult part of the journey were the many military checkpoints they passed through on their journey west.
Documents were checked very carefully, and this, of course, slowed down our movement and introduced some nervousness because armed people were inspecting our documents.
It took 4 days to traverse from Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine to the western border with Hungary. That's about the same distance as St. Louis to Washington, D.C. Viktor says a weight lifted when they finally crossed the border.
We had saved our lives, escaped from the shelling. We had already begun to think about what lies ahead. It was no longer fear, it was hope.
4 days later, they arrived in Frankfurt to fly to Chicago where their son would be waiting. Volodymyr says he barely slept coordinating his parents' 8-day journey out of Ukraine because of the 8-hour time difference.
Never wish anyone to experience this. It's mentally draining. You want to be there and to do something physically, but you simply cannot be there.
While he's relieved his parents are under his roof now, Volodymyr says they still face challenges. He says their travel visa will expire in a matter of months, likely before it'll be safe to return to Ukraine.
I don't want to come to the point where I need to make a decision if I'm a rule follower or I am for the safety of my parents.
As a naturalized U.S. citizen, Volodymyr says he was encouraged when President Biden announced the U.S. would accept 100,000 refugees. He says he's frustrated now because it appears little has changed since the announcement.
We have a saying that if you said something, do it, or better, don't say this.
Volodymyr says his next priority is getting his 2 siblings and their families to the U.S. from the German refugee camps they're staying at right now. He adds most of the other Ukrainian families in St. Louis are in the same situation, either housing family members who managed to escape or waiting for a way to get them here. In St. Charles, I'm Eric Schmid, St. Louis Public Radio.
All right. Thanks, Eric. Let's, Michael, do you want to start off?
Yeah, I'll start with the voiceovers. You asked us if we thought that the voiceovers hit the mark, and I'll start by asking you what were you sort of hoping that they might sound like? What was behind the question you asked us in that?
I think when I was cutting it together, I was under a lot of time pressure deadline because there were other things that were coming up. So it's kind of like I just needed to get this piece out. And I was concerned that the voiceover wasn't as emotive as maybe the language could have been. And it might be just second guessing, but I felt like there could have been a little bit more coaching when it comes to the inflection in the way that the voiceover was.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in listening to it, I mean, the tricky thing about voiceovers is when I listen to them, I feel like, yeah, you don't want them to be dull and monotone and completely stripped of any emotion that's actually in the words that your source is speaking, but you also don't want them to seal the scene either. So yeah, so they might have they might have benefited from a little bit more coaching, but I don't have a lot of experience in that area myself. Maybe Kris does, but I it didn't really stand out as a big problem for me. I thought it sounded fine, although I think you make a good point that it could have used a little bit more inflection, but I don't think it was a weak point in the piece.
Who did the translations for you?
I have a source who owns a translation company in St. Louis, and so I contacted her, and they did the transcript of like the 40-minute interview for us.
Got it. Okay, I feel like in a dream world, the person who translates it could also do the voice for it, depending on the voice how it matches, because then they do catch the inflections that are lost in translation. That's like a dream situation, obviously. But I agree. It didn't. I don't think the person that you had speak didn't take away from the story. Maybe there's little inflections that were missed because it was reading from a transcription, but for what it served in the story, I thought it worked fine. There's a a lot of what we want to do is also expose our audiences to different languages so they hear the full language. So in a dream situation also, maybe you had a ton of time and we could listen to the entire soundbite depending how long it was. These didn't feel too long. And then either have you come in and translate briefly, summarize what he said, or she said, so then the audience gets to hear that language. I've heard that done in Spanish translations a lot, especially if they're shorter. But this is kind of your standard way of doing it, and it works. I think it worked. I do wonder, there's a way around it. Maybe if the son could have helped like bend the bridge in the translation there during the conversation, perhaps that's another way to try to do it. It's interesting because this whole story is about recounting a story, a really important story, and I think overall it's really successful. I like it, but it's different tricks on how to do it. But what you did with it, I think, does work.
Definitely. One thing you did ask was if there was a way to make the intro more lively, and that's one thing that kind of hit me was the intro. I thought was, I mean, it was standard. I mean, it was just sort of like, here's what's happening. Lots of people driven from their home. This was going to be a story about these two people who came to the United States. But then I hear the story, and the story itself is so powerful, and there's so much, emotion in it. I feel like I would have wanted an intro that hooked me sooner and sort of got me really interested in the story before I even heard it. And, and maybe, something about, I'm just, thinking off the top of my head, but, after, a harrowing 4-day trip across Ukraine and another 4 days, to the United States, a Ukrainian couple is now living with their son in St. Charles. I mean, something that sort of gives me a taste of what I'm going to hear, rather than just, sort of the statistics about how many people are homeless. But I think that's one way that the intro could have been livelier, just sort of give me a taste of what I'm going to hear in the story. Just make me want to hear more going into it.
Michael, that's a really good point. I was the editor on that story, and I that's one thing I really want to work on myself. And I think as editors, sometimes we tend to sort of overlook the intro because we're so focused on the body of it and what people are saying there. And I just think sometimes, not that we throw away the intro, but we don't pay enough attention to it. That's a very good point.
Yeah, Holly makes a good point in the comments saying, this is a good opportunity for the take me there style of an intro, painting a picture of the ordeal. I think along the lines, I know that Eric, you'd asked about like building a lively scene, and it's kind of hard when you're just going to talk to people that are just going to tell you how they got here. And what you did was good. I love where you say in your tracking, like inside, and then you hear knock, knock, door, and then we go inside. That was just, that was great editing there. That Nat is great. The tour, or like the, hey, this is my mom and dad, like that works in here. Other ideas that I had that you could try is, the tour is always a good one. It's the best backup, but are they cooking any food together? That's, go to them when they're doing something, culturally familial. And that's a great place to like get us to immediately care about this group of people who we're getting introduced to. We're immediately in their family sense. I may have mentioned this last time, but especially when they're recounting a story, if they have a photo album, which I know they probably don't, or like photos on a phone, just scroll through and just tell us what you're seeing. That drives a lot of emotion from their sound bites. That can help also put us into connecting with them in a compelling way as they talk about what they left and what they don't have anymore. Or if they had home videos or anything like that, which I know in this situation probably is not the case, but anytime you can get them to walk down memory lane to look at something is a great way to get some good sound bites and get us to connect with them. How did you do the interviews?
So the interviews were, they were sitting in their kitchen, and I would ask a question of their son, he would interpret it and ask his parents, it wasn't like a direct, like, what happened here, but it was more, I guess we sat down, we talked a little bit before starting the interview, kind of like what my goals were and why I was there. And then we started the interview. I would pose questions or like pose a thought or an idea that I wanted to have some sort of response to. It was interpreted, father or mother would respond, and then it would be reinterpreted back to me. And one of the challenges here is that the son is not a somebody who does interpretation very, very often. So some of the details or some of the specifics were lost, or he might have glossed over some of the more grotesque details, because I think it's hard for you to hear your parents talking about this type of thing. So it was one of these. I felt at a deficit in the interview, and then looking over the actual transcript, it was trying to square certain things that Volodymyr said, which I inferred as his interpretation of his parents' experience, because they had been so tightly together. So he had said certain things of like, he was speaking, some of what interpreting in between the lines of meaning of what they actually said. So that was another thing to kind of, I don't know, balance and juggle out.
Well, I mean, the sound bites that you did get from them were fantastic. They were really great. So the interview sounds like it, even if it may have glossed over as a listener, I think what you were able to pull through the translation is really great, and it makes the story really strong. Your writing's really good in it too. So I commend you for that. I'm trying to think if there's any other notes that I had. Oh, one thought that could work to keep, since we don't really have a lot of scenes, except for the initial one. This is a chance to possibly pull in some news footage, especially if they're alluding to a specific event, like a bombing that was covered on the news. Pulling that audio from a TV report could help at least put us in the sound context of, in the mindset of, oh my gosh, I forgot, this is news. This isn't your grandparents telling a story. This is news right now. That just helps keep you in the story of what they went through. Anyone else thoughts and on this story, and whether it's about the voiceover strategy or building a scene?
I remember listening to this at home, barely awake, because I think it was morning edition, and just being really pulled into the story and finding myself really compelled with that. So I would not have imagined that you were rushing to get this done. So kudos on that.
I'm interested.
Go ahead, Clay.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I'm interested from when you got the call to when you conducted the interviews to when you got it all translated, you wrote it, like, what was the time frame? How fast did you have to work? I'm just curious.
I think that we had the message to me, saying my parents are here, you can talk to them. That was sometime in March. And then it was probably like 3 weeks or so in between that. Then we had an interview on Monday, and I think the piece aired the following Wednesday. So not 3 days, but like a 10-day turnaround. And I had the translation transcript probably, by that Friday or that Monday. So it was a pretty fast turn.
Yeah, Eric, I think you're right. First of all, let me apologize. If you guys hear hammering in the background, I'm having siding put on my house and they're right outside where I'm working. So I apologize for that. But as the editor on this, also there was time pressure because we wanted to get, this was in the news. Obviously it was really big at the time, and it's still big. And also we hadn't seen a story like this locally. So we wanted to be first with it.
Yeah, the last thing I was going to add is I think the structure works really well. I love how you end it with, they got here, but that's not the end of the story. There are a lot of challenges still happening, and the family still has family over there, and the families here still has the visa issue. So you leave it in a really good place where it's not over just because they got here. So I like that. Any other thoughts, Eric, on your story, or from anyone else before we move on? Awesome. All right. Well, Eric, thanks again. Applause for submitting. Cheers.
Yeah, really good story. I like it.
Yeah. All right. We're going to move on to Williams from Nebraska Public Media. William, I think we don't even need to cue you up. I'll just play the story for everyone. But the story is titled. The story title is "Pickleball is beginning to make a racket in Nebraska."
Eddie Brown is hooked on pickleball, which, depending on his schedule, he likes to play 1 to 3 times a day and stream for spectators on Facebook. Today, he's playing at Speedway Village Sports Complex in South Lincoln.
Monday through Friday, we have a 5:30 a.m. group that plays to 7:15 a.m. This group here starts at 8:30 to 11:30, and then in the evening, we play generally at Genesis.
Pickleball was invented in 1965 in Bainbridge Island, Washington. It's commonly described as a combination of tennis, badminton, and ping pong, played on a court about a third the size of a regular tennis court. It can get intense.
Oh, no, I gave him a point!
The sport is exploding in popularity. According to the United States Pickleball Association, participation increased more than 20% between 2019 and 2021. The organization estimates there are about 4.2 million pickleball players across the country. Bill Rares sits on the board of Pickleball Lincoln Incorporated and is the United States Pickleball Association's ambassador for Nebraska, a role he's held since 2019. He started playing in 2009, and ever since, it's been his mission to help expand the sport, especially in Lincoln.
When we started the club, it was basically 3 of us, but 5 years ago when we first got Peterson Park open, we had about 20 members to our club, and as of today we have 755 members. So it's growing exponentially.
Based on an informal poll sent to pickleball associations across Nebraska, Rares estimates there are just over 2,700 pickleball players statewide compared to around 900 in 2017. Rares says there are 3 main reasons why.
Fun, fitness, and friendship. And those 3 words just jump off the page.
One of the biggest challenges to the sport, finding enough space. Rare says even with 30 pickleball courts already in Lincoln, more are needed to feed the growing number of players. Nowhere is this appetite for expansion and the tension it can cause more pronounced than in the central Nebraska town of North Platte, population just under 24,000. The tennis courts at the city's Cody Park have seen better days. In many places, chunks of the blue squared concrete look as though they've been ripped out of the ground, making play challenging at best.
It has caused many injuries to high school athletes. It literally needs to be closed down.
Barb Baldridge is president of North Platte Pickleball and the city's USPA ambassador. Her organization plans to raise about $125,000 toward transforming the tennis courts into pickleball courts.
With the growth and the demand, your best bet is to find a location that already has a foundation that a lot of these courts aren't being used.
Baldridge says the space is needed as her organization flourishes, going from 12 members in 2019 to 120 today.
The growth for us in Midwest Nebraska is just amazing.
Not everyone is happy with the situation at Cody Park. In a letter to the editor in a local newspaper, Mary Johnson writes the courts have seen plenty of use in the past and would see more if they were just repaired. Quote, "I'm glad pickleball has so many players and is an up-and-coming sport, but why take away tennis courts when the pickleball courts could be built elsewhere?" Pete Voles is a North Platte city councilman and says the council is looking at taking the opposite approach. He says if the proposal is approved, there are talks to build the tennis courts at the local schools.
We don't want to diminish tennis, but we do want to add recreational opportunities for our citizens with pickleball as well.
To some degree, this has also shown up in the business sector. Andrea Jensen is a director at Nebraska Pickleball, which runs out of the Union Bank and Trust Sports Complex in Elkhorn. She says even though the complex's arenas are designed for basketball and volleyball, she's had no trouble renting out courts for pickleball.
I get a lot of calls from families and moms and dads that want to play with their little kids.
Mike Sanyuk is a tennis instructor at Miracle Hill Golf Course in Omaha and resists the idea that there could be a brewing turf war between the sports. He says it's all about flexibility, noting many play both sports, especially as tennis players begin to age and are looking for something less strenuous.
In our industry, just like in any industry, you have to adapt with time. There are a lot of clubs here in Omaha that I know of, specifically the country club scene, that definitely dabbles in pickleball lessons.
Barb Baldridge in North Platte sees things differently. She says she can see a future where pickleball overtakes tennis in popularity as the fight for space continues.
And it's not that we want to take over, it's just supply and demand.
William Padmore, Nebraska Public Media News.
All right. So, William, the question that you posed to us for the story is the question about how newsworthy is the story for other stations. Obviously, it's a bit of a softer feature, but how do other people feel about how newsworthy this story is and the format it's told in? I'll just jump in and start and just say I think it's a really fun story that's packed full of info on pickleball, which I know is kind of a thing. I've been hearing about it picking up. I learned it in like elementary school in PE or something, but and there's a lot of great voices in here, and the Nat sounds in the beginning are really fantastic. Michael, do you wanna kick it off with your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as far as its newsworthiness, I mean, obvious. I mean, it's not, it's not something that's going to change a lot of lives, but I mean, I think just, I mean, you've got something that is growing in popularity and is causing, tension as far as, like how communities are spending their money and renovating courts and just finding space, so, from that alone, I think there's a newsworthiness to it. The thing that surprised me most is knowing that this sport has been around almost as long as I have, and I've never really been aware that this thing existed. I'm not sure where I've been, but I really thought that pickleball was a relatively new sport. So, I mean, I like the piece. I think that, the one thing, at the beginning, the guy who, talks about how often he plays pickleball. I mean, I think, the one thing that I'm left kind of wondering about is, you've got this, 57-year-old sport that just seems like in the last several years is exploding in popularity. Why now? What is it? Why in the last 5 years is suddenly, why is it so popular? And maybe your first guy, rather than telling you what time he plays, could have talked about, what is it about it that has him hooked and makes him want to play as much as he does. I think that was, the one thing that was missing for me is like, what is it about this sport that really just gets to the people who plays it and makes them want to play as much as they do. But I liked it, and I like that there's some controversy in it. And are those courts in North Platte decaying because tennis players aren't using them, or are they not using them because they're decaying? I mean, I think it's an interesting question there.
Yeah, I had the same notes Michael did. I think the first we spent about 2 minutes in the story. It's a 5.5 minute story, which is fairly long. But we spent about 2 minutes kind of setting up the growth of pickleball recently, and I think that the point is made pretty early on. And I agree with Michael. I didn't need to hear the first soundbite of the gentleman playing, listing all the times that they play. I wanted to hear why he was there. Why is this? And we get to the fun, that quote at the end, like, it's fun, it's family and its health or something like that, that's great. And so I kind of like outlined the piece. The first section is like, growth is happening, but that could be a bit shorter. We could tighten that up.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second section is how Nebraska is expanding the space to keep up with pickleball's growth. And then the third part, which is the part where I really started getting interested in it, is the challenge in the competition for court space with tennis. Pitting these two sports against each other was like, wait, oh, they're competing for space. There's tension in the story. I want that teased up a little higher, so I know that there's some conflict happening here, which the second half of the story is full of it, and that's great.
Mm-hmm.
I was surprised. I don't know if your host intro teased it more, but I agree with Kris. I felt like I was about to listen to just a fun story about the growth of pickleball, and then the story changed. So it felt almost like two stories. Yeah. Whereas I think there could have been a little bit more foreshadowing of the controversy in the first part to let me know that racket that's being raised is not just the popularity of it, but it's really causing, is there enough room in the world for two sports? That kind of tension, I think, could have been forecast a little bit earlier. And then one thing I thought was interesting, I don't know if you did it on purpose, but the contrast between the very active sound of the first half and the quietness of the North Platte was telling, because things are happening in Lincoln, but there's this sort of problem at a stalemate in North Platte. And you could have said something like, in North Platte, you're not going to hear as much of that pickleball noise because the courts are, in a mess or whatever. So there could have been two pickleball stories, or there could have been just one is fun pickleball, controversy pickleball, or there could have been a bit more like threading of that controversy throughout the story. But I really liked hearing the pickleball sound throughout that first part. That just kept me in the moment.
Yeah.
I'll jump in if it's okay. Yeah, I mean, I love sports stories, so I'm never gonna say no to it's not good. Kris is laughing at me about that, but I mean, I've covered the Indy 500 for several years there. So, I mean, the one thing that got me, I think, that was just being careful to overuse natural sound. I think for me, it was, I loved the pickleball sound, but it became almost distracting at times for me when it was like having it run constantly for a while. It started feeling a little bit much. I would almost want to think in my head of is there other sounds around pickleball, whether maybe it's someone getting out of their car, and they're talking about how much they love coming and play, why they come and play, or at the front desk door. I don't know, thinking of ways to integrate that a little bit, because it just, I started getting a little fatigued on it. It's something that I think in sports stuff, that's sometimes a challenge with stories that not just us hear it of there's the action sound and that's what's used. a lot, and just finding ways like diversify that a little bit with like sports not just necessarily being like the ball bouncing on the court and people yelling, but there's anything else possibly to pull in there. That was just my, everything else I think has already been noted, but that was my one other thing in my mind. But yeah.
I do think it could have regional, your question about regional, I think if you had made it a bit shorter, like a bit tighter there, as well as maybe bringing a few statistics between like contrasting tennis popularity with pickleball popularity, that could have been a bit of a regional, like that could be sort of like, people wondering, wow, I wonder how popular it is in my area, but that could have been an area that you could have dwelled on a little bit. And again, just a bit more, is it easier? I mean, you hinted that it was maybe a little less difficult on the older people in the world, but I think that could have helped you broaden it out for a regional audience as well. But it was a fun story.
Definitely. William, do you have any thoughts or questions?
Oh yeah, well, let's talk about pickleball, right? But listening back to the story, one thing that strikes me is that this is a tale of two cities about pickleball. It's 5.5 minutes, probably doesn't need to be that long. I appreciate all the criticisms concerning tightening the story. I have a bad habit of broadening out my stories to the point where they lose focus. And I think that's what occurred here to a certain extent, because it did take a turn, because it's not where we started, right? We started out at a pickleball court and all of a sudden we're to business. And I think that could have been interesting if it was more to the point and shorter, maybe like a minute shorter or something like that, maybe cut out a few characters, but I just think maybe too many characters and not enough focus. I'm glad that people have to think the story though, because that was the original intent. And it's interesting that people point out the tension, because originally in the original versions of this story, that wasn't as.
Uh-oh. I think William cut out. Oh, he's coming back.
If anybody's in the room, yes, you're back.
He's back. Okay. All right. But when I was workshopping the original script with a mentor of mine, he pointed out that tension in some of the transcripts that I had. And he was like, wait a minute. You're talking about all this pickleball stuff and you're not going to talk about this? You need to pull this up. And I was like, oh, okay. And then so there were some production challenges in that way, in that I sort of had to not rewrite, but not even modify, but take certain themes of it and expand on them. And that probably maybe contributed to the length as well. But yeah, this was a challenging one for me just because there was that whole, I was a big defender of this story at the time when it aired, but then I kept thinking about, was it worth the time? I don't know, but I appreciate your validation that it was, that you think it was. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing it.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts from anyone?
I was just thinking about if it like trying to find space, and this comes from like my perspective, having tried to play pickleball and like having all the courts be taken up and there's no space for it, is, one of the things you could have thought about doing or done is staked out a busy pickleball court and then try and catch people as they're walking up, and then knowing that there's no space for them to play, and then like trying to nab them and go, how do you feel that you can't play right now? And they'll probably be like, it sucks, I'll have to come back later. I really wanted to do this today. That could have been, a 5-second bite that could really liven up the element of, people are really excited about doing this.
That is an excellent idea. That would have been a hard sell to my news director, I think, to stake out the pickleball court. But I will agree that maybe there were some characters that could have been cut and more like that could have given more personality to the story. I think that's That's right. And I do want to touch back on another criticism about the natural sound being too prevalent in the piece. Yeah, that also was a thought that crossed my mind. There needed to be more diverse sounds in there. Maybe somebody rifling through a ball or a bin full of pickleballs or something to break that up. Yeah.
All right. Well, everyone, round of applause for William for sharing his story with us. Thank you. Daniel says, when deciding what to cut, pass around the script to your peers and ask where they lose interest. I had a journalism professor do this for all of our stories, and it was helpful when it came to deciding the organization of a story. I agree. I've done that type of an editing situation for features and also for more long form stories. Everyone make a note, do the script when you start drifting away, and that's a possible spot to go revisit and rework. Okay, Samantha Horton, we have your story up next, and this story is titled Getting Venison at the Food Pantry. I'm reading from the KCUR's headline for this, but this was a regional story. Kansas and Missouri won't warn you if it has lead fragments. Iowa does, is part of the story, and the story is rooted in mostly Iowa. So this is from our Midwest Newsroom Fellowship that's focused on lead poisoning or lead levels in Midwestern children primarily. So I'll go ahead and play this one. Full disclosure, I was the editor on this, so I probably won't speak as much on this, but I do have some thoughts. So everyone else, please chime in.
Label.
Oops.
The state started doing so after.
Sorry, let me restart that. Okay.
Midwestern hunters often donate extra game meat, like venison, to food banks. Sometimes that meat comes contaminated with lead ammunition, which can be harmful to children. The Midwest Newsroom's Samantha Horton reports.
At a warehouse in Hiawatha, Iowa, the Hawkeye Area Community Action Program is one stop for deer meat donated from hunter to consumer. Communications manager Kris reaches up to open one of the food bank's giant walk-in freezers. This is where the donated meat is stored.
Our shelves are a lot more bare than they have ever been. So especially on those items that are high protein items, those are items that get hit pretty hard.
On the white plastic packages of donated meat, a label reads, "Lead fragments may be found in processed venison." The label also notes that there have not been any cases of lead poisoning from lead in venison. Iowa stands out among Midwestern states with this type of warning label. The state started doing so after finding lead in 2 venison packages out of 10 in 2008. Donated venison in Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska comes with no warnings. Angela Anadapa, president of the food safety nonprofit Alliance for Advanced Sanitation, says Iowa's label contradicts the notion that shoppers should have confidence in the food they pick up.
This is a situation in which if you're already telling the consumer, hey, there could be lead in your food, that is not consistent with our food safety values.
Lead poisoning can lead to behavioral issues and lower IQs in kids. According to the CDC, there is no safe level of lead for them. Indeed, Colorado School of Public Health professor Michael Kosnett says while it would take a lot of contaminated venison to poison a child, even a potential small amount of lead exposure could be harmful.
We are talking about the intelligence of our children. We are talking about their potential for doing well in school, doing well in the workplace.
Minnesota Department of Agriculture's Nicole Neeser says her state found lead ammunition can fragment up to 18 inches from a deer's wound canal and be as tiny as a grain of sand. She says Minnesota has been x-raying the processed packages of firearm-hunted venison for more than 10 years, discarding any lead-contaminated meat and keeping it out of food pantries.
The last 6 years, we averaged about 10%. And so that's still a very significant amount of meat that's getting thrown away because it has lead particles in it.
Since screening of donated meat is inconsistent or non-existent across the Midwest, some people are taking it upon themselves to make sure lead contamination doesn't happen. Meat processor Mike Evinger of Knoxville, Iowa, makes generous cuts around where ammunition might be found.
It seems like every year we will get some caught up in that grinder. I don't know there's any way. I mean, we cut our meat up pretty fine. You know, we don't leave big chunks. And it still gets by us.
You can't really walk through the forest without making noise. So if you just kind of walk like a hen turkey, like crunch, crunch, and then like she's scratching for bugs.
Iowa hunter Pete Araldi is walking his hunting paths in a nearby wilderness area. Right now, it's turkey season. But he also hunts deer. He's voluntarily switched to non-lead ammunition.
You don't hear about people ending up in the hospital from eating lead from like venison or something, but at the same time, why take a risk if you don't have to?
While conservation of wildlife is Araldi's primary reason for switching ammunition, he says eliminating health risks to his family is also why he is sticking to copper slugs. Reporting with Jared Strong of the Iowa Capitol Dispatch, I'm Samantha Horton for the Midwest Newsroom.
This reporting is part of an investigative project with the Missouri Independent and the Midwest Newsroom called Unleaded that examines lead poisoning in Midwestern children.
All right. So Sam's question generally about this was, does a story work telling it outside of deer hunting season primarily, which is a challenge. I think this is a great story, an interesting angle to talk about the lead levels in children issue, but I will open up to Michael first.
Yeah, I thought it did work. I mean, you've got two scenes that obviously, you know, you're in the warehouse and you don't have deer hunters dropping off their venison, but you've got the frozen meat, you've got the guy talking, you know, showing you the package, you're talking about the, you know, the strangely labeled meat that says maybe there's lead in here, maybe there's not, good luck. You know, so I think, you know, I think that worked as a way to say, you know, here's how we can create a scene without actually meeting, you know, a deer hunter who's dropping off venison. And then being in the woods, again, you know, you're talking to someone who does hunt. It's not deer season, but he's, you know, he's somebody who's, you know, it's a chance to get into the woods. He's talking about, you know, using a different type of shot, which offers a solution. But again, you know, he's not out hunting deer, but, you know, you can't control what time of year it is. So I felt that, you know, I didn't feel like you lost anything because you were reporting this story in, you know, what was it, May, rather than November. You know, I think you made the best of, you know, the time of year that you had to report the season. So I felt that it worked on both ends.
Other thoughts from other reporters or editors? Sam, I would say, listening back to it and having listened to it a bunch of times, one thing that I might change up if we're reworking this is I think the transition between the meat processor and the hunter could use a little assistance because we're going kind of a sort of a scene back to back there.
That was how I felt too. Yeah.
Yeah.
It just felt, it was like a weird, I was trying to blend that transition, but it felt so clunky because it was like, we're doing a big shift and I was trying to use the sound, but I felt like it worked. And yeah, that and indeed, I felt so awkward saying indeed. I know you had me say it, but I don't know. I hear it and I cringe when I hear me trying to pull the indeed off. So.
That's how you know I edited a piece. Indeed is included in it.
Let's work that into every story.
Any other thoughts or questions from you, Sam, or for anyone on the piece?
William, did you have something you said? Sorry, I think it might be caught over speaking.
Oh no, sorry, that was my mistake.
Oh, okay. All right, you're good. No, I mean, it was just one of the structure things. I think I appreciate it. It was just more for me, it was like making a story with like, you know, the standard scenes you would try to go get just not existing. And even like the original food pantry I had venison still in stock. And I was like, this is going to be great. And then they were like, we won't let you come visit. And I was like, awesome. So I had to like get a little bit creative of like, okay, here's a pantry that's letting me visit, but they don't have any in stock right now. So there was just some kind of, I feel like, creative working to make it work. I mean,
it definitely is Sam can give tips on setting up a story in another state with a lot of unpredictability, not the ideal scenes, and trying to figure out how to make it work, which I still think it did. And I think this was something, by the way, that caught the attention of Science Friday. Sam was on Science Friday, and they put her whole web story up on their site, and she's been on a couple talk shows about it. So it was a really interesting subject, and I'm glad we didn't let, they have that saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good or something. I'm glad we didn't do that, because if we had said, oh no, it's not venison season, I think we would have missed an opportunity. Again, this is part of we've done about 8 stories now on lead levels in the Midwest, and this was a really unique piece for that. So I was really glad to have it.
I get to try that whole process that you mentioned, Holly, again next week in Omaha. So we'll see how this goes again.
Oh, Nebraska.
Yeah, I mean, it was an important story to tell, and it was told well. And like Holly just said, I mean, it wasn't, artistically, it wasn't probably what you would have hoped for. But I think, the important information got out there, and obviously the interest that it's gotten, sort of proves that out. So, I think that, you did well to make the best of, what you had available to you.
Yeah, I know Kris and I were going back and forth about keeping the hunter in the piece, which I know that was like, I died on that hill. I'm so sorry, Kris. I was like, I will fight for this hunter to stay in the story. But I hope, I appreciate it. Thanks for the feedback, everyone.
Cool. Well, thank you, Sam. Applause for sharing, being brave. Thank you. So we have about 6 minutes left in the hour session. Steve and Michael, if you have time, I'm okay to stay on a little longer to get through Steve's. And if anyone else wants to join, please stick around. Steve, are you okay to stick around?
Yeah, I think that works. I've got a few minutes after I think we can go over. That's
Okay,
all right
cool.
with you guys.
I think we, like 15, and we can do this in 15 minutes. And if anyone needs to leave, we understand. But it's also helpful when you stay and help. Okay, so let's get to Steve's story. Steve's story is titled "Hoping for a Miracle at Parade Park." Sort of titled that. I'm playing it from the Kansas City Today podcast, so bear with me a second to get it pulled up. And Steve, you had a few questions that you were looking at in this story. You wanted to know if the audio turned out okay, whether the scene was meaningful and convincing, and if the script reads okay, which is kind of a complex story. So do people understand it?
Yeah, that's basically it.
Okay, here we go.
To those areas, and it's just like a trickle-down effect.
We'll tell you about one woman's mission to increase Black home ownership in the city's urban core. But first, one of the oldest Black housing cooperatives in the country is in trouble. Parade Park in Kansas City faces the possibility of foreclosure if a federal agency isn't satisfied that enough progress is being made to fix up deteriorating conditions. And residents say they're not clear about what's going on. The Midwest Newsroom's Steve Vacrot has more.
Parade Park was built in the 1960s and sits near the 18th and Vine district. It's a housing co-op, which means that the 240 or so Black families that live there share in the ownership of Parade Park, which is governed by an elected board of directors. On this Monday, some 50 residents gathered in the parking lot to hold an election about what to do with their buildings. They hope the result sends a message to Parade Park's board of directors.
The ballots will be counted at approximately 6:15. Okay, so if some of you that are here right now, if you want to stay, you're more than welcome. We're all about transparency with the membership.
The problem at Parade Park is it's been falling apart in recent years. If the gutters aren't missing, many are sagging, portions of the roofs have fallen in, and residents talk of using buckets to collect water seeping inside their apartments.
I speak for this community. I've been here 40-some years. My children have all moved away from this place. It's a dump. You saw the burned down buildings. They've been here for months.
That's resident Carrie Miller, who called for Monday's election to choose between two paths that Parade Park can take. Do they want a vast and costly redevelopment of Parade Park, or a rehabilitation that could result in a smaller Parade Park? Connie Mahone, who has lived in Parade Park for 48 years, knows her preference.
This needs to be redeveloped. You can't,
We've lived here. There are so many things that are wrong. You know, it needs to be built up again.
Years ago, Parade Park got a loan, about $10 million, which the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, guaranteed. The loan is in default, and it's not because Parade Park can't repay it, but rather HUD inspectors saw the poor condition of the property.
The project failed miserably for on the inspection.
That's Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, who helped persuade HUD to give Parade Park's board more time to come up with a plan. But the hitch now is that the extension ends on July 7th, and by then, HUD will need to know how Parade Park intends to fix up and keep its buildings in proper condition. Parade Park's board would not discuss its plans for this story. When residents gathered for the Monday election, their choices were either a large redevelopment undertaken by Community Builders of Kansas City, a local nonprofit developer, or a likely more moderate rehabilitation with consultants from the National Association of Housing Cooperatives, or NAHC. Hugh Jeffers of NAHC said a plan he's working on with the board could include selling parts of Parade Park to other developers. In April, the board voted in support of a redevelopment and to present that option to the membership, but that hasn't happened. When Kansas City Mayor Quentin Lucas wrote in June to the Parade Park board to get an update, board president Harrietta Harris replied that the board was working with the NAHC to find a developer. Lucas worries that time is running short.
It's time to fix Parade Park. We're trying to give a pathway to fix, but we need the board of directors, to be partners in that, and thus far they have not been willing to vote to do so.
Estimates for a large overhaul of Parade Park are between $80 million to $100 million. There's concern that could result in residents getting priced out. The fee residents pay to live at Parade Park hasn't increased much in years, which is part of the reason why there's not much money for repairs. A redevelopment would almost certainly make Parade Park more expensive. Archie J. Williams, a board member until March, said it's just too late to rehab the property.
And we know prices will have to go up. That's reality. But it doesn't have to be to where it's pricing people out of the area. It's staying African American is very important as well.
Resident Carrie Miller, who helped organize the resident election, says that she's willing to pay more each month to live in better conditions.
I'm a retiree, and I'm on a fixed income too. Absolutely, I am willing. If I have to go to Walmart and be a greeter, I deserve better. My neighbor deserves better.
At the election, 68 voted in favor of the Community Builders plan for redevelopment, while 12 voted for the NAHC. So far, the board is disputing whether it was a proper election.
So that music was part of the podcast, not part of what Steve's edit is. Also, full disclosure, I edited this piece too. So Michael, you can kick it off.
Okay. And I think one of the questions you asked was just about the audio, well, about the use of audio and whether the scene, I guess, when you asked about whether the scene was convincing and meaningful, were you talking largely about the beginning of the piece, or?
Yeah, the beginning, this impromptu election that the residents are holding to sort of try to force the board's hand.
Yeah, I mean, I thought so, because I mean, to me, that was, I mean, you know, an effort by the residents to sort of have a voice in the future of where they live. I mean, it was, you know, to me, it was them trying to have a voice in the process. So to me, there was some meaning, and and to me, you kind of came full circle at the end by giving us the results of of this election. So yeah, I did think there was some meaning in it. One thing I had a question about, and it may have been that the people you talked to were in different places, but I noticed that there would be some ambi behind them, then it would drop out, and it would sound like you were tracking without a lot of without sound behind you, but then the sound would come back up when there was when you were talking to them again. Were those people who were in the same place, or were they in different places? As I was, and maybe it's just something that I would hear, and maybe the average listener wouldn't notice, but I kind of felt like ambi would drop out and come back up again, and I'm just wondering if that was just because of where the people were, that they weren't all in the same location.
Some of them, a lot of them were in the same location. There were, like, everywhere I was at, for the most part, there were a lot of people around. So like it was hard to reduce like background noise.
Sure.
But yeah, that's kind of what I ran into.
Okay. Yeah, and the only the one thing that kind of lost me at the end, because you were talking about like the two options, I think the very end where you refer to the fact that they voted for the NAHC, I kind of forgot what that meant. Going back, and I think that you know, I would have liked to have been, you know, rather than just, you know, having the, you know, referring to the NHC, you know, what that meant in practical terms. I think that was like the developers that might end up selling off part of it or something like that.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
But yeah, I mean, I liked, I mean, you know, I feel for the people who live there. I can, you know, I can see what they're up against, and everything from, you know, this place that really needs to be rehabbed, but the fact that, you know, redevelopment probably means, you know, that it would be more difficult for them to afford to live there, you know, so I think it's a really good story. And I can also appreciate the difficulty in trying to convey it to, you know, someone who's listening to a story rather than reading it. But I like the story.
Thank you.
The Steve, re-listening to it, if I was going to go back and retweak this, I would bring us back to the scene one person sooner, because of, I think Archie's his name, because he's got the background there. So bring us back there. And then, like Michael said, just hit one more signpost, which takes up time, but reminding the listener that there's the two options, what they are, so we remember what that means. I don't think it's, I think people understand that, but it's just that quick reminder, like, okay, what was the other option again? Because we've been talking about the other one for so long that that could be another useful signpost. Anyone else thoughts or?
I have. This is Clay in Iowa. I have two questions. Number one, how many lines was the host intro, and how long was the story itself?
I think the host intro was 3 lines, and the story, I think, came out full version to like 4 minutes and 40 seconds.
Okay, so fairly standard. Your best tape was Carrie Miller, I think was her name. I wanted to hear her at the very beginning of the piece. Maybe you could explain what a Black housing cooperative is in the host intro before you get in there. And then you start in the scene. I wanted to be, you know, in there. I wanted the descriptions you had of the gutters sagging and everything. I think that would have hooked me right away on an important topic. That was the one thing that kind of stuck out to me.
Yeah, that's a good and valid criticism. It was a little bit of a challenge for me just knowing how to set it up, because I think in the original script we kind of went straight into that scene, but then it was like the difficulty I had was like, is it too abrupt? Like, are people going to wonder like, well, what's the selection? What the hell is it about? But yeah, you're right. I mean, and Carrie Miller was great. I thought her cuts were really kind of helped make the whole story sing.
And I guess too, like, you also probably had to figure out like, how do you be respectful about talking about this neighborhood and what's happened, and not trying to, you know, I don't know, come across disrespectful or sensationalizing how you describe the place.
Yeah, I was very nervous about that because, like, you know, the nature of it, and, you know, the whole situation. I didn't want to seem condescending. I didn't want to seem anything like that. And so I tried to take a lot of care, both in the audio and the digital package with that.
Cool. Yeah, I thought it was an important issue to bring up. Yeah, good job.
One thing that I liked about this, and I edited the web story, was that I knew right away the importance of the story, because this is one of the oldest Black co-ops in the country. This is not a story about an average community that's deteriorating. This has like stakes, and if we did a podcast about it, we could go into like history and you know, all the kinds of things that having a Black co-op really meant to people at that time. But I also thought, and I put it in the chat, I because I had such a deep dive in the web version, listening to the audio again was refreshing, because it really is an art, I think, to making those two pieces unique to their platforms, native to what they mean, and what they bring to the user. And I think that was a good example of how you did that, Steve. Bringing people into the story digitally and bringing them into the story audio. I agree. I would have loved to have that picture painted a little earlier, like what it looks like, as well as Carrie. But otherwise, I'm tongue-tied. But it just drew me in as a story. I found it pretty compelling.
Yeah, thanks. And that was a story like what Eric Schmid talked about. I was under some deadline pressure because we had to get it out ahead of this HUD deadline, and then the following week I just wasn't going to have time to work on it, and so.
Because Kris and Holly were breathing down your neck. Just kidding.
Yeah, as far as the beginning of the story, I think I flipped it once for Steve because I think my thoughts were that the tension of an election was really interesting, even though in the end it may or may not have meant anything. It's just a voice for them. But as Steve knows, I told him multiple times, like, Carrie was fantastic. She's a really good voice for the story and really just conveys, like, it's a dream tape situation, everything that she said, and it just really carries the heart of the story. Any other thoughts or questions from you, Steve? Or go ahead, Eric.
I was gonna say that one of the when dealing with community meetings or this type of audio where there's kind of chit chat or like a lot of crap going on in the background, for lack of a better word, one of the notes that I got before doing some stuff at the Olympic trials last year for NPR, the editor there said, go out, do some MOS, and leave after every single interview, just stand there for like 30 seconds, 45 seconds where you were. And that gives you your bed before and after that bite. And even if it's really loud, it makes more sense going into and out of when you have that loud bed, and then the person is speaking and it's loud, and then you go out and there's a loud bed. So I've tried to just in my interview tracks have a little bit of a bed at the end, so that those transitions can be a little bit easier to do. And that's just like a really easy way to kind of take care of that, and then also make it so it's not as jarring in the audio edit.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Any other questions from you, Steve, or thoughts from anyone else?
No, this has all been really helpful. Appreciate it. The one thing I neglected to mention in the audio version, and I think I cut it, but I wish I would have left in that the mayor's mom lives in Parade Park, but that was one of those like tiny little cuts we had to get rid of.
Yeah, that's a little more weight to what the mayor said.
Yeah.
Thanks to everybody who stayed on. This is really helpful and proof that we can almost do 4 stories in an hour. And it's very heartening to see the variety of work that's coming out of you all, and I love that you all get to hear each other's stuff and comment. It's really gratifying. So thank you so much, and thank you to Kris and Michael for sacrificing your time to listen and make such careful, thoughtful notes. Love having Fred here as an editor. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Fred.
And this is great because it makes us all better, I think, when we do it this way. And we'll do another one. Kris, any thoughts, any parting thoughts? Michael, any parting thoughts?
No, just thanks for everyone who submitted a story, and thanks for everyone who hung in there and listened. This is great. I really enjoy it.
Agreed. And if anyone wants to reach out to us for to brainstorm a question, scenes, whatever, Michael and I are available to help you do that.
Yep.
All right, everybody. Peace out.
Thank
Talk
you
to
all.
you later.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Great day.
You're not a liberal bond vote. I mean, look at your resume. How would you describe yourself politically?